Hello, everyone. Welcome to Radically Normal. This is Michael. I'm here with Andre, and today we have a guest. We're doing an interview with Dr. Ashley Hales, who is an author, speaker, and also the podcast host of Finding Holy. She got her PhD in English in Scotland, and she's the author of the 2018 book, Finding Holy in the Suburbs. And today we're talking to her about her forthcoming book, A Spacious Life, Trading Hustle and Hurry for the Goodness of Limits, which comes out this September. Dr. Hales, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Awesome. And aside from what Michael just said to introduce you, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit further, maybe about some of the things you're working on?
Sure. Yeah. Well, my husband and I and our 4 kids just recently moved from Southern California to Colorado. So we are working on unpacking a lot of boxes and trying to enjoy our new place and going on lots of hikes. But other than that, most of the things I am working on at this point have to do with promotion and marketing materials for A Spacious Life, with a few odd, just early morning. Sometimes I'll get some morning pages in and write a little bit of memoir. I'm eventually hopeful to be working on kind of translating some of my PhD research into something more readable for people who don't like reading PhD dissertations.
Wow, that's awesome. And Andre knows I can't resist asking, but my dad and I do a lot of mountain climbing. So where exactly do you live in Colorado, and what have you done?
So we live in Erie, which is north of Denver and probably about 15 miles outside of Boulder. So we're just exploring a lot of Boulder Canyon right now, and hope to make it to Rocky Mountain National Park soon later this summer.
Okay. Do you know what the Flatirons are?
Yeah.
Okay. So I climbed the first one, like the one further right. If you're
so cool. Okay. Awesome.
Okay. So
I'll have something to tell my teenage boys.
They love the climb.
Yeah.
But I'm sure our listeners are here for something other than climbing. So just to kind of jump into your book, talking about the goodness of limits and a spacious life. So one of the premises of the book is about this intersection between freedom and limits. And when we think of freedom, we like to think of limitlessness. But how does placing limits on our lives actually increase our freedom?
Yeah, I think most of us, we can really relate to the problem of limitlessness, where we realize, either you've scheduled too many things, or you've got I remember in high school, I took way too many AP classes, and I think I thought I could do a lot more than I was actually capable of. And it resulted in this breakdown my junior year of I can't do all of these things. And so we have a visceral sense, I think, of when we go past or transgress our normal human limits, that we often we feel exhausted, we feel overwhelmed, we don't feel more human, we don't feel like we are living this kind of flourishing life, this easy yoke that Jesus promises us. So I think we can all understand what feeling overdone and living without limits feels like. But I think most of the time we still think, in part of our soul, that the way that we get to a meaningful life, a spacious life, is actually by doing more, right? Like putting more good things on the calendar, or working really hard, or making sure we check off our Bible reading plans, so that these are the sorts of activities. The more activities we do, the more generous we are, the more we show up at church, that will actually live into this more spacious life that Jesus promises us. But what I found really interesting as I've walked through this idea, and as I walked through the narrative of Christ in the Gospels primarily, is that we actually see that we weren't created for limitlessness, right? That limits are part of God's good creation. They're not something that happens because Adam and Eve sinned. So limits are actually built into creation. They're actually good. The limits that God gives us are good. Now, we go all off and create really bad limits too, and we use limits often to suppress or silence other people. But the limits that God gives us out of his love are actually the ones that intend to help us flourish best. I like to just think, if we think about, if we didn't have any sort of speed limit, right, on the freeway, if there were no guardrails, if they weren't dotted lines, that freedom would really turn to danger really quickly. And there would be a lot more casualties, right, on our highways. We need some sort of boundary lines, right, to know where we're supposed to go. Probably a lot of your listeners too can also think about how stressful it is, not only to choose a major, but then to figure out what you're supposed to do with your life. that when like every option is open to you, like it causes us to shut down and we get overloaded and we have decision fatigue. Instead of saying, maybe, you had a counselor growing up who was like, you tend to be really good at humanities, or you have a really great engineering brain. And that gives you a lane to go in that actually increases your freedom and your ability to play and be curious and creative, than actually when we have every option open to us, we tend to shut down.
That's really, really good. And thank you so much for those insights. I think one thing that definitely stuck with me is how you said during your junior year, you had the feelings of breaking down. I think all of our listeners can relate to that. I know for sure that I definitely can. That seems to be the peak of high school for a lot of people. But
right.
I think that another thing that our listeners, I think can really relate to and resonate with is kind of this grind of college or high school and work, and then the thoughts of having a family, and it feels like the grind kind of goes on and on,
Mm-hmm.
And it feels like these are things that are necessary for us to do. How do you think we can differentiate between biblical rest and unbiblical laziness?
That's a great question. I have a chapter on the book about the importance of rest, not only like a Sabbath rest, but also just like even in the course of our day. How sleep is actually important. It helps our bodies function as they're supposed to. Like we have these limits, right, that God created human beings to have. Like you can't skimp on sleep for too long or you will feel it, not just in your body, but like you'll feel horrible, like pulling those all-nighters to try to do well on an exam, and then you feel disgusting for like a whole week. And so I think these sorts of limits help remind us that we're human and that there is a proper place, like you're saying, for good rest. And usually that rest looks like it has to be directed towards God, right? If God is the center of our identity, if he calls us his children and we're being invited to live within his good limits, then our rest that's directed towards him is good rest. And so, I mean, you might need more sleep than I do. We all recreate differently. But I think there's different ways in which we know that we function best. And for me, so some of the things that I do, we try to really take an intentional Sabbath as a family, which means like usually screens aren't on. We try to make sure like we're playing as a family. We always eat dessert first as like a celebration, that this day is special. My kids love that, and probably that's what they will remember is that we got dessert on Sundays. And that these are the sorts of like celebratory acts of rest too. So sometimes our rest looks like ceasing from overwork and simply resting and sleeping. And sometimes it's like a celebration towards God and with people we love about his work in the world, and just getting to exult in creation and each other. But to answer your question quickly about the laziness bit, most of the time, I think when we are on kind of our Western treadmill of hustle and hurry, it looks like we're doing more. And so we use rest to like, kind of like we're a piece of technology that we're plugging in. And so that because we've overworked and we're overexhausted and our battery's empty, so we use rest to kind of plug ourselves in so we can be productive again. What's beautiful about the creation story is that rest actually starts, right? The people, Adam and Eve, right? Their work begins out of rest. And that's what the Sabbath practice is too, that Sabbath begins in rest, so that's we first receive before we like go out and do our work. Our work is a response to the rest that God has given to us. And so maybe a question might be, do I feel like a piece of technology where I'm overworked and my rest then is so that I can be more productive? Is a good kind of diagnostic question. And then, or like, does my work feel like I'm resting in who God made me and the people he's given to me and around me? And that's going to feel a lot different. It's going to feel lighter probably than like, I'm just exhausted and now I'm binge watching Netflix with bag chips.
Wow, that's so good. I've never thought of rest that way, but I love what you said about a Sabbath. I'm not like a Sabbatarian per se, but last year I read John Mark Comer's The Ruthless Limit of Hurry, which was great. And one of his chapters convinced me to take a Sabbath. Though since then, whenever I'm in school, I take like a 24-hour period off of work.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Which
awesome.
is just so rejuvenating.
Oh, for sure. And so you talked a bit about like screens off during your family's Sabbath. So, and I was looking through the table of contents of your book, and chapter 3 of the book was titled "Jesus Isn't on Instagram." So, can you talk
Yeah.
about the role of like limiting our social media use as a path to freedom?
Yeah. I think what's fascinating, I think, is often when we get on a computer or we get on our phones, it's to kind of escape. It's the same idea of like the way that we misuse rest and we use it like to plug in and be more productive. I think often we're on social media to like escape the pangs of being an actual person in an actual body in a particular moment of time in a particular place. And so with like social media primarily, you can kind of be everywhere at once. And so it kind of, it feels like a life of freedom because it feels limitless, right? Like you can be conversing about this topic with this group of people. And like, if you don't like that, the way that person's voting and, they live with you on your dorm room floor, or they're your actual next door neighbor, like on social media, you don't have to interact with them. Or you can tell them how stupid they are, right? In the Facebook comment. And so I think the kind of allure of social media and the allure of the internet is that you can be like God. It's Satan's kind of early question to Eve, like, you'll know good and evil. And I think what's really important for us to remember is that God desires to be with us in those places of pain, or boredom of being a person in a particular place in a particular time. And I think it's just important sometimes to begin to ask ourselves those questions about, why am I going here? If you feel envy creeping in, or you weren't invited to that party that you see on social media, or whatever it is that you begin to feel because of your experience on social media, or you're getting angry, and then it's easy to categorize like one group of people or a way someone votes, and demonize a group of people. Once you kind of realize that those sorts of things are going on in your own soul, I think taking breaks is just like a little social media detox. Andy Crouch in his book Tech Wise Family talks about making sure you have an hour a day a week, and a week a year where you are going without your screen, not checking email, not flitting around social media. And I think that's a really helpful boundary, as we don't want the things we consume to consume us.
That's really, really good. And kind of like Michael said, that he looks at table of contents. Another thing we looked at is the press release for your book. And just wanted to reiterate to everyone that it is coming out soon. You guys should definitely check it out. But in that, you discussed a little bit how parenting kind of gave you this new lens of kind of establishing limits, narrowing your focus, and that kind of thing. A lot of our listeners don't have kids, or potentially don't have kids. What tips do you have for young adults on maybe some things that can help ground them and help them set some of these natural limits that you kind of mentioned? And could you potentially describe how some of those may apply to our lives here?
Yeah. Well, hopefully, I think if we all learn a little bit to like live within our limits earlier, I think that would be great. I think, unfortunately, so much of our cultural narrative is the way that we succeed, the way that you're like a valuable, worthwhile human being is to be productive, to be helpful to society, and to like, the only way we can be happy, we think, is by working harder and spinning our wheels a little bit more and achieving. And it's not to say that achievement is bad, but I think we can often transgress our normal human limits to try to get from our achievement something that achievement can never provide. And so what I love about the story of the gospel, right, is that our identity primarily is received. It's not achieved. And so that means we live differently, right? We live within limits. And so whether or not you're a parent, I think a few things, even if you even just want to think, okay, like, how do I structure my time? Because I think a lot of the time we think of freedom, we think of unlimited autonomy, right? That's what it looks like, at least in America, to be free, is to basically do whatever I want with whomever I want, whenever I want. And as long as it doesn't bother anyone else, then I'm free. And so I have the freedom to kind of craft and curate my own life. And of course, that's leaving us exhausted and overwhelmed. But if we just even think about something as like what our structure of a week looks like, or a structure of a day, I think thinking about, how much time am I on my phone? Am I trying to get something out of my social media interactions that only God can provide? Am I actually sleeping? Am I caring for my body and viewing it as a temple of the Holy Spirit instead of simply like overworking and overdoing it? And even you thinking too, like, what are my unique limits? Maybe when you've had a really crazy busy week, a finals week, like it's probably good then to like step back and like slow down and do less the next week. Even thinking about like, what are my natural rhythms and how has God made me? You might be way more extroverted than I am, and so your limits of being with people and around people are larger, right, than mine. And so even just being aware of what are some of kind of my personality limits, what are some of my bodily limits, what are limits in my time, and then also what am I choosing? Maybe like what are my like triggers that tend to help that I will transgress those natural limits? So maybe you consistently overwork your body and you're like working out too much, or maybe you're skimping on sleep, or maybe when you get in a rut, you're always on social media, or you're doing because you don't want to actually go through pain or suffering with God, and it's easier to just keep working harder. So I think even just spending time with God, asking him some of those questions about where are my particular limits that I tend to transgress, and would you be present with me in them?
That's really good, because I like what you said there, because I actually was Andre and I were with a group of guys who were on a ski trip in the winter, and we were in Colorado, staying in the Breck area, Frisco area. And I was sharing with the group how I felt like when my schedule got too full, like I would get too anxious about the schedule. And so one thing that I always try to like prioritize into the schedule though is community, and like specifically like with the local church that I'm a member at. And one thing that I feel like, and I just read a book on church membership, so maybe it's just in the front, like in my mind, but I feel like we've like lost this idea of like being plugged into a church and having the right community, I guess, and like prioritizing that. So where do you see Christians falling short of God's vision for community, and how are our hurried lives impacting that?
Yeah. I have a bit in the book where I talk about, some of the metaphors Jesus uses, right, to talk about the church, right, is that we be salt, right, salt of the earth. And one thing I love about salt is it makes food taste really good, right, when it's used properly. And most of us don't use enough salt in our cooking, but I think so you have to have a lot of it together to actually do something good. Like instead of like one little salt crystal grain is really not going to do anything. You're not going to taste it. It's not going to be flavorful. You're not going to get your pasta water like the right. Samin Nosrat, who wrote Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, it was a documentary on Netflix as well, talks about like your pasta water should be as salty as the ocean is. I was like, oh, I've been making pasta wrong my whole life. But what I love about that, and that Jesus talks about his people as salt, is that we have to be combined together and like kind of dropped into this boiling pot of the world to be flavorful, right? To affect change, to do anything. And I think, unfortunately, there's so much in kind of our Western American worldview that says you need to like leave everybody and like find your own path. Like that's all of our origin stories in early American literature. And instead, Jesus is saying, actually, you need to be drawn together in a big old group to be able to affect change. And that our deepest identity is, yes, with God as beloved children, but secondarily as part of the church. Because the church tells us how we belong to a people, right? And it tells everyone else who is not a Christian that God and grace are actually real. Because who else, when you have all of these disparate people who vote differently, who look differently, who come from different cultures and ethnicities and languages, and still choose to be together because God's grace is bigger than that. So I think, yes, find a local church, dig in, be yourself, warts and all, and let other people be themselves, warts and all, and wait for the Spirit to show us what does it look like to actually live in community. We'll find ourselves a lot more fulfilled than trying to kind of curate our own autonomous lives. I agree.
For sure, that's really good. And our last two questions are kind of just lighter questions we like to ask all the people we interview. And we've kind of started doing this recently, and you have kind of given a few people that you've kind of given as resources that have impacted you or that you used already. But we love to ask, who's an influential person or Christian thinker, author, podcaster that has impacted you recently? Partially just as another thing that our listeners can go and seek out if they want to.
Thanks. One of my favorite pastors and writers writing today is Scott Sauls, and he's written maybe 4 or 5 books. And he really is trying to write in this intersection of what does the gospel say, and then like how do we live in the world. He's a sane voice, he's a gentle voice and a kind voice, and so I really appreciate Scott's kind of warmth towards people and understanding our brokenness, but also pointing us to the goodness of Jesus. So he is one that I really enjoy reading and listening to his sermons online. I've been reading a lot of Charles Taylor, who's a Canadian philosopher.
A secular age is right behind
yes, exactly. I'm like, I don't know if that's everyone's cup of tea, but he does kind of give us a road. He does kind of give us a roadmap for a lot of what's kind of happened culturally, and so I really appreciate his wisdom. And it's pretty readable for a philosophical tome. So that would be kind of some good starting places, I feel like.
That's awesome. Thanks so much. Love the Charles Taylor rec. And I'm looking forward to, I actually want to read Scott Saul's book on, I think it was A Gentle Answer or something.
Yes. Yeah.
So,
it
and then
came out at a good time.
Yeah,
with COVID and everyone shouting at each other. So it's definitely worth a read.
And our last light question is, I have a cup of coffee right here, and we're big coffee drinkers. So do you have do you like coffee? Do you like any specialty drinks, anything of that sort?
I love coffee, and yeah, I just drink a black though. I feel like I'm 80 years old and drinking coffee now like my grandmother, but there we go. But
That's
yeah,
awesome.
this is just my water, so I actually drink it. Yeah, it's with my little straw.
Awesome. And thank you so much again for joining us today, and definitely check out the book for all of our listeners, and check out the resources that were mentioned, and hope you guys enjoyed this episode.